I think human consciousness was a tragic misstep in evolution. We became too self-aware. Nature created an aspect of nature separate from itself. We are creatures that should not exist by natural law.
Well, that sounds god-fucking awful, Russ.
We are things that labor under the illusion of having a self, this accretion of sensory experience and feeling, programmed with total assurance that we are each somebody, when in fact everybody's nobody.
I wouldn't go around spouting that shit I was you. People around here don't think that way. I don't think that way.
I think the honorable thing for our species to do is deny our programming. Stop reproducing. Walk hand in hand into extinction. One last midnight, brothers and sisters opting out of a raw deal.
Happy heresies, and welcome to the desert of the real. Welcome to the machine, my son, and the means to escape it. Welcome with kindness and love to Aeon by Gnostic Radio, broadcast from the virtual Alexandria, that state of mind where East meets West. Always through the God above God, Dad Kim. This is your incessant exploration of the world's most influential, yet least known heretics, the Gnostics, as well as their brethren in the esoteric and Dionysian free thought. We shy away from scholarly pontification and definitely avoid New Age verbal hemorrhoids. We don't take prisoners but liberate them. We are not the final authority on anything, but hope to be an endless possibility for everything, culminating with you finding the mystery that works for you and only you, uncovering any holy or unholy information that liberates you from cosmic and personal oppression, from the powers and principalities that rule so many fools' heavens around you. We ride with those searching for the truth and avoid those who have found it.
If you could be either God's worst enemy or nothing, which would you choose?
Philip K. Dick put it best in his novel, The Divine Invasion, in a scene spoken by the Gnostic Savior before he gets ready to go back to Earth. It goes, "What a tragic world this is. Those down here are prisoners, and the ultimate tragedy is that they don't know it. They think they are free because they never have been free, and do not understand what it means. This is a prison, and few men have guessed. But I know," he said to himself, "because that is why I am here. To burn the walls, to tear down the metal gates, to break each chain." Or, as the book of Thomas the Contender says, "The archons will give them an illusion of truth, and will shine on them with a perishable beauty, and it will imprison them in a dark sweetness and captivate them with fragrant pleasure."
How are you to imagine anything if the images are always provided for you, while knowing they're false? This is a marketing holocaust. 24 hours a day, for the rest of our lives, the powers that be are hard at work, dumbing us to death.
Aeon by Gnostic Radio is not so much about answers, but insights. Too many institutions and their gods out there are full of answers. Answers for everything. Answers on how to live your life and tell those around you how to live their lives. So many answers. Those prisons built with stones of law. Those brothels with bricks of religion, as William Blake said. If you want certain answers, instructions to reach a paradise constructed by the fantasies of hating angels, Aeon by Gnostic Radio might not be for you. Instead, better rely on fridge magnet spirituality that leads you to the slaughterhouses of comfort, or that truth in numbers fallacy. Play it safe and play right into the hands of the archons of this age, right into the bondage of the average.
What truth? That you are a slave, Neo. Like everyone else, you were born into bondage, born into a prison that you cannot smell or taste or touch. A prison for your mind.
After all, Krishnamurti said truth is a pathless land, and I say Gnosis is that pathless labyrinth. An adventure aeons in the making to reach the aeons that bite back at fundamentalism, literalism, and intolerance, through the image of the profane and into the tangibility of the sacred. Science guides us, art inspires us, and our dreams light the way, all fueled by the inner flame of our untamed love for the downtrodden, the meek, and those who give from their poverty, as Jesus refers to the saved in the New Testament. As Osho once said, creativity is the greatest rebellion against existence, especially against Jehovah and his butt slaves in the establishment. So let's create better than the creator gods. Let's write our own gospels and live our own myths.
By the power of truth, I, while living, have conquered the universe.
It's like God's vagina.
On this October, the year of our demiurge 2016, I am so infernally happy and honored and excited to finally have April Deconic back to the virtual Alexandria. April's scholarship has truly promoted, crystallized, and elevated Gnostic studies for years. Her keen insights on the ancient heretics is often without peer. She has graced the show before for third eye-opening topics that include the Gospel of Judas, the Sethians, Gnosticism in the Gospel of John, the Goddess in Christianity, and more. Check these out at our iTunes, YouTube, and Stitcher channels, or at our archive of past shows.
Sell crazy someplace else. We're all stocked up here.
In this eternal now, April materializes at the virtual Alexandria to discuss her latest and overdue book, The Gnostic New Age, How a Countercultural Spirituality Revolutionized Religion from Antiquity to Today. Let me be straight and clear on April's new book. If you want to truly understand the Gnostic essence, culture, and philosophy, this is the work you need to read right now. It's that good. Even when it comes to finally reconstructing to a working knowledge of what rituals and magic the Gnostics utilize, the Gnostic New Age is it. It's that good. And it not only adequately summarizes Gnostic history, it provides the latest scholarship that most of you don't even know. I certainly didn't know some of them. Like the fact the Mandaeans were founded by a woman mystic named Miriam.
He's not the Messiah, he's a very naughty boy!
Reading April's book might make you as wise as Valentinus, as keen as Simon Magus, and as liberated as Basilides. It's that good. You'll realize, as I've been saying for years now, that we do live in Gnostic times, a Philippitic world, and that the Gnostic message is more essential, more counterculture than ever.
Listen to me. You have to consider the possibility that God does not like you. He never wanted you. In all probability, he hates you. This is not the worst thing that can happen.
It isn't.
We don't need him.
We don't agree.
Fuck damnation, man. Fuck redemption. We are God's unwanted children. So be it!
For more information on April, please visit aprildeconic.com. That is April, Deconick. Not much else on my end, but please support Aeon Byte Gnostic Radio in any way you can. A few shekels here and there. Other avenues to keep this red pill cafeteria open are found at, you got it, thegodabovegod.com. I can't do it without you. Oh, you Donnie Darkos, you spiritual entrepreneurs, you modern-day Tom Sawyers, your mind not for rent by any god or government. I can't do it without you. As for me, your humble servant, as some have asked, a year ago, our baby Ellie was fighting for her life at the hospital, and our family was reeling from deaths in the family. Today, Ellie requires attention and therapy, but she's the happiest baby I've ever seen, just over a year old now. We are indeed blessed down here in the Canoma, and I'm still Abraxas in his meat space incarnation of Miguel Connor. Still a recovering alcoholic, sci-fi hack, and general madman across the waters of creation. I am still your Pompatus of Gnosis, and you are mine too. And this show, being number 339, means we've covered so much ground and are ready to continue on that pathless labyrinth called Gnosis. I hope you continue on this journey with me, and thank you for your company, especially in these strange times of shifting imperial holograms and the sanity of American culture collapsing as the Archons attempt to once again blind those who are waking up. Same as it ever was. Welcome to the Gnostic New Age.
What dignifies the yogic practices is that the belief system itself is not truly religious. There is no Buddhist God, per se. It is the self, the individual mind that contains immortality and ultimate truth.
What the hell is not religious about that? You've simply replaced God with the original self.
Yes, but we've localized it, at least to know where the self is. It's in our own minds. It's a form of human energy. Our atoms are 6 billion years old. We've got 6 billion years of memory in our minds. Memory is energy. It doesn't disappear. It's still in there. That's a physiological pathway to our earlier consciousnesses. There has to be, and I'm telling you, it's in the goddamn limbic system.
You're a wacko.
What's wacko about it, Mason? I'm a man in search of his true self. How archetypically American can you get? Everybody's looking for their true selves. We're all trying to fulfill ourselves. Understand ourselves, get in touch with ourselves, face the reality of ourselves, explore ourselves, expand ourselves. Ever since we dispensed with God, we've got nothing but ourselves to explain this meaningless horror of life.
You're a wacko.
Well, I think that true self, that original self, that first self is a real, mensurate, quantifiable thing, tangible and incarnate. And I'm going to find the fucker.
This is the Aeon Byte interview, and with us we definitely have the pleasure of being joined back again by April Deconic, this time to discuss her new book, The Gnostic New Age, How a Countercultural Spirituality Revolutionized Religion from Antiquity to Today. How are you doing today, April?
I'm really well today. How about you?
I'm doing great, and so happy to have you on after a long pause, but this is definitely worth the wait. I really enjoyed your book, and I'm glad it got written. And like I said, this is the kind of book that I would love to put at the level of Hans Jonas and the Gnostic religion. It's a very good book.
Wow, thank you very much. That inspires me to keep going.
Oh, I do hope so, but this one, you're going to get a lot of mileage out of this one, I believe. So why don't we get to the main event, and that is the reality, As most scholars have basically taught us for years, Gnosticism was either a sort of heresy that sprouted out from the Christian movement, or in the more recent Karen King, Michael Williams paradigm, Elaine Pagels to a certain extent, Gnosticism is sort of an alternative Christianity. It's sort of a nice sanitized term. But as you argue, Gnosticism is actually a new way of spirituality. Why is that, April?
I realized that we were dealing with a new spirituality when I started thinking about writing a book that would be more constructive in terms of understanding the Gnostics. So instead of kind of deconstructing the Gnostics and saying what they aren't, or what they are in negative terms, what I wanted to do is really be like an anthropologist and study this material to understand what they were really thinking about and doing themselves as Gnostics. And when I use that phrase, I'm not attempting to use it in any monolithic sense. I understand the diversity of various Gnostic movements. But what I saw when I looked at all these Gnostic movements in all of their glorious detail is that these movements were talking about worshiping a transcendent God. They were talking about meeting and knowing a God that was beyond the God of all the religions. This included all the Greco-Roman religions, the Egyptian religions, the Jewish traditions, the Christian traditions. So I realized that they had flipped a switch here. Something different and revolutionary was going on in their worship and in their understanding of who God was. And so as I started thinking in this direction and writing in this direction, I realized that they were really countering the majority of religions at the time and the way people thought about their relationship to God. And that's when I started to perceive Gnosticism as a form of spirituality or a metaphysical orientation in which the person looks toward a transcendent God as the object of worship rather than a God of one of the religions that's already conventional and established.
And you would say this is the core characteristic of the Gnostics. I believe the other one, and of course you can talk more, is as you write, most religions in those days were either servant spirituality or covenant spirituality.
That's right.
But the Gnostics were definitely an ecstatic spirituality, drawing from the ancient shamans and Pythagoras and so forth.
Yes. Actually, I outlined 4 different types of spirituality. So you have a servant spirituality in which you understand yourself to be a subordinate, a mortal subordinate to an immortal God who's all-powerful, who you fear. And oftentimes the God is very arbitrary in these systems, so the God just does whatever the God feels like doing to you. And there's not a whole lot you can do except grovel and hope that you're following some of the things that the God would like to see so that he doesn't cast famine on your city or something like that. In the religion of the ancient Israelites, that old kind of God gets tamed a bit, and I talk about this in the book, and a covenant form of spirituality develops in which God has to play by his own rules. So he has a set of laws or rules that he plays by and that the humans play by, and if the humans do wrong, then they can be punished by the gods. So it's a little less arbitrary, but it still is very much a form of spirituality in which the human being is subordinate to God. And in this case, you nailed the God model is that of a king. And then you have also you mentioned this ecstatic sort of spirituality that arises within the religions of antiquity, in which the God is still a very much an out of reach God, superior to the human, but the human wants to be able to kind of close the gap between the human and God and venture into the God world or the other world to meet the God. And so part of this you can see in the ancient Greek mystery religions as they develop. And then I think that the sort of Gnostic spirituality kind of comes out of that ecstatic moment, that ecstatic experience, but that it's really flipped the model of how the human and God interact. And so what's fascinating about this is while the Gnostics are worshiping this transcendent God, the other piece of this puzzle, which is really important, is that they believe the human being is innately related to that transcendent God. In other words, you could talk about it in terms of having a piece of that God inside them that is their real self. And so that's also very different from the other forms of spirituality at the time. And the idea in the Gnostic systems is that the human being wants to reintegrate that God self with the transcendent God. So they develop all sorts of ritual activities, all sorts of sort of liturgical prose and narratives and so forth in order to achieve that goal.
This really makes sense, especially when you have this sort of core elements of what were Gnostics or what was Gnosticism, because a lot of scholars and people always say, well, the Gnostics were syncretic, or you have, for example,
Right.
David Bracke in his great book, The Gnostics, talks about hybridity and so forth. But I believe you're arguing that what happened is these people had their visions or revelations and they had their core elements, and they were simply going to draw from anything around their culture, magic, Egypt, Greek philosophy, Catholic rituals, to support their viewpoint and also to use as rituals to connect with this alien God.
Yeah, that's right. And what helped me with this vision, right, of the Gnostics was thinking about, well, gosh, how do people do religion today, in today's world? What is it we actually do? And the sort of New Age movement and even the spiritual but not religious people that I think have kind of come out of that movement, the orientation toward the individual religious experience and then searching texts from different religions and teachers from different religions and so forth to try to put together, right, the big picture. And that's how I think of these ancient people. They were religious seekers like today's people, and they had a moment in history where you have what I would consider real internationalization beginning there, especially in the big cities like Alexandria and Rome, and you have a lot of people coming from different parts of the kind of Mediterranean world and even off, into the East, coming together with new ideas, texts, teachers, and they're all talking. So you have kind of a blend, I don't know how else to say it, of individual religious experience and this kind of textual world and teacher world that makes for this wonderful moment when I think this Gnostic spirituality arose. And when you think of Gnosticism in this way, as this form of spirituality, you end up detaching it from any particular religion. So you no longer really talk about, well, what is the origin of Gnosticism? Like, that's almost becomes the wrong question. The question becomes, once you have Gnostic spirituality online, how does it integrate with the traditional religions? And then really, I think, turn them upside down.
I guess the question would be, how is this subversive? And I love how we don't want to talk about, some people say, well, it wasn't that subversive, but I love that you point out in your book a sociologist who said, well, if you have an elevator and everybody's staring at the door and somebody walks in and stares to one side, that's going to be extremely subversive to everybody in the elevator, and eventually you might get fired from your job. So is that what the Gnostics were doing was just looking at a different way that everybody in the Roman Empire would be going, what's their problem?
Exactly. And you can track that reaction. That's what's so fascinating. I started to think about, well, how can we really talk about this sort of transgression then? Because people today, we don't want to talk about people being transgressors. we want to talk about people being diverse or alternative, right? But the fact is that if you look at sociological literature, transgression and deviance is a real thing. And it's a real thing from the perspective of the main culture or the dominant culture. And I think that's what we had going on here in the past, is that the Gnostic spirituality was so subversive, because if you think about it, what they were saying is, look, the true God is this transcendent God above all the other religions, and all the other gods, they are either far lesser and very much less important, or they're even demonic, and we should stop worshiping them. I think that people in the ancient world, that this was a message that was a very scary message, because it implied if I stop worshiping the God, famine will come to my city, all sorts of horrible things might happen to us because the gods are angry. So that's one aspect of the subversion, and the other is to say that you're connected to this God, and that essentially you are God, and that you are equal, if not more powerful, than the gods of all the conventional religions. That's scary too.
Oh yeah. So it would be like the Romans believed, as you write, in civic duty, civic religion. The Neoplatonists with their great chain of being and all that is the same as in the 60s, where we had, Protestant Catholic religion here in the United States, God Love America and all that, and these hippies came and started importing all these religions just to support their view of pacifism and drugs and all that.
It actually is an interesting parallel. And I actually see the parallel kind of starting there, but even being more interesting in the 70s and 80s with the full-blown New Age movement, where you have this call of these various grassroots teachers to revelation, to channeling, and this divine knowledge that they receive, and then how they hook it into traditional scriptures, which they read in really subversive ways. I'm really interested in the future of my work and writing to go in that direction, and I'm really interested to see how certain New Age leaders were doing exactly those.
Oh, I'm sure it's another big labyrinth, especially with today's New Age and the amount of money it has. And again, like the Gnostics, it's not very centralized, so it must be hard to track.
Right.
And another thing, April, is that most assume that the Gnostics, when they were talking about the transcendental God, the alien God, or that they were basically basing it off the one of Plato. But as right. You argue, it's actually another God, an ancient God from Egypt.
Yeah, I think it's actually the tomb god, and the reason that I think this is that not all the Gnostic mythology has this Platonic God in it, okay? But they all have a transcendent God in it. And the mythology that most of the Gnostic circles were talking about is a mythology that looks to me very much like the mythology of the ancient god Atum. And this god was a hermaphrodite. He laid in water. When he was, you could think of him kind of as being not yet conscious, he was unconscious, as a snake. And that the beginning of time, he stands up on his mound or leaves the water, something like that, becomes erect, and he shouts out a great roar. And he also is as a hermaphrodite, then is sexually involved with himself and produces then gods that become lower than him, eventually the gods of the Egyptian pantheon. So he is called the god the god of millions. He is the one and all, and everything comes from him. And his consciousness, his being awake, is what perpetuates the universe. And if he ever goes back to sleep, everything comes to an end. So it's a really interesting sort of structural mythology that you see references to in everything from the Hermetic materials, to the Nicene materials, to the Valentinian materials, and so forth. Even the notion of the eight with the Ogdoad. I really think that if we want to investigate some central ideas of Gnostic mythology, I really think that mythology needs to be looked at more carefully. Now, all that's not to say, Miguel, that the Platonic God doesn't become involved in this. He's certainly part of this discussion, and I would say that there are Gnostic groups that are going to bring that God and all of his attributes and discussions into the conversation and into the mythology.
And another point, too, is that there was a time years ago when you had Timothy Freak and Peter Gandy releasing the Jesus Mysteries. You had an interest in Elaine Pagel's book, The Gnostic Paul, which is just a Valentinian exegesis of the Pauline corpus. But there was always a resistance from most mainstream to actually say, well, Paul really isn't a Gnostic. He might have had some ideas. But with your book, with your idea, it becomes really more crystallized in a way that Paul seems to be more Gnostic, because isn't he basically saying, hey, there is an unknown God that the Jews and Gentiles haven't seen forever. He just happens to be Yahweh.
Exactly. Once I realized that, boy, the light bulb went on. Because you can see that this sense of spirituality, again, doesn't have to be a full-blown mythology, but Paul is somewhere there aware of a God that's been unknown, and he makes these arguments in his letters that he gets to meet in a revelation. And he connects it in with Yahweh, and then of course he sees Jesus as being Yahweh's manifestation. So it becomes very, very interesting to think about Christian origins from that perspective. That perhaps there is this element of this Gnostic spirituality is in at the ground level, not again in terms of a full-blown mythology, but certainly this discussion of a transcendent God and a universalized God, which is something else that Paul does. What he doesn't do is he hasn't detached Yahweh from this God. So he wants to continue, he still understands Yahweh to be this God.
So with Paul, it's no problem that the creator God of this world is still the ultimate transcendent God, but we're still controlled by these evil angels and archons and powers and principalities.
Right.
So what do you think happened? What was the split within the Protestants, yes, they weren't around, the Catholics and the Gnostics? It was simply interpretation, or what happened?
In Paul, we have two things going on. We have this Gnostic spirituality that he is developing in the text, although again he's understanding Yahweh and that transcendent God to be the same thing. But he also has what I call seeds of Catholic thinking in his text as well. And so one can, and it's done, read Paul in both directions. So Paul then becomes a real funnel for both later Gnostics, who are I think rightly reading Gnostic spirituality out of this text, and I think then he also becomes a feeder into Catholicism, which grows up in the 2nd century, and being read by them rightly in that direction as well. So I think that that might be a better paradigm for explaining sort of the emergence of both of these tendencies and both of these interpreted trajectories out of Paul. And I think the same is going on with John, the Gospel of John.
Yeah, that's what I wanted to ask you next, is the Gospel of John. In this view, it also becomes more apparent when you see the Gnosticism in it, beyond Bultmann and his work on the Gospel of John. And, for example, one passage which was fascinating to me, there's that passage where Jesus confronts the Pharisees and he says, your father is the devil. But you actually say that the original translation or the original manuscript say that you are from the father of the devil.
Right. And that's not okay, so let's talk about where this is from. So that is actually in the Greek of the Gospel of John, but it's usually just not translated that way. how John 8:44 is usually translated in our English Bible. So it says, "You are of your father the devil, and your will is to do your father's desires." But the Greek actually says, "You are from the father of the devil, and you want to carry out the desires of your father." And so we have I got clued into this text actually when I was teaching a class on the Gospel of John, and I sat down and I read back through the Gospel of John, and I came to this passage in Greek, and I read it and I reread it, and I said, "Wait a minute, what's going on here? That's not an English translation." And so I got really curious about this because, of course, if you have the father of the devil, that's a very different thing than saying your father's the devil. And I began to see in the ancient literature that there was a dispute in the 2nd and 3rd centuries about how to translate the passage among the Christians and among the Gnostics. And the Gnostics were using it to prove that Jesus taught about a transcendent God, and that the Yahweh God was the father of the devil. And so that made me start to rethink the Gospel of John. Well, what if the text really was talking about the Yahweh God as being the father of the devil? And if we read the Gospel of John through that lens, what would it look like? And that's what I'm trying to do in this chapter.
And obviously the unknown God is Jesus talking in these very mystical terms about a God that nobody knows, that only he knows. He's a God that's beyond the eyes of the Jews for thousands of years.
Exactly. So again, I suggested in this one that, and here I think that we actually have even more of, I think maybe even a early Gnostic author of this text, but that the text as it was taken up within the Catholic tradition begins to be read in different directions. And so the way it's read and interpreted, right, is determining its orthodoxy.
And do you feel that the reason, let's say, the Gospel of John or the Pauline letters were taken by the Catholic was to sort of stick it to the Gnostics, or do you think they found it attractive? I mean, what do we know about these movements? I mean, the Gnostics were, like you talk about, they were writing commentary on the Gospel of John first and so forth.
Right. Well, and Miguel, keep in mind that not all Gnostic groups were interested in John or Paul. I mean, there are some groups that are so marginally Christian or not Christian at all. So, but the ones that were interested in John and Paul, they maintain that text meant that early. And so they don't themselves see their interpretation as being something new that's getting added onto the text. And I think that's kind of important to understand, because the Catholic position has always been the Catholics have read this text correctly from the beginning. It's their text, in fact. It's a Catholic text. And the Gnostics just took it and did subversive things with it. Did things that were not intended ever by the author of the text. So what I'm trying to do is question that, and I'm trying to say, look, how a group interprets that text is what is going to ultimately determine the meaning of that text for that group, and then they're going to use that to support and give authority to their own movement. And so that's what I see happening. So you have this text, the Gospel of John. Again, it has, I think, even more seeds of Gnostic spirituality in it than what Paul had in him. It also has seeds of Catholic thought in it. And so both of those groups, as they develop, are going to, and I'm sorry I'm using the word group for Gnostic. I really don't mean to, because they're really multiple. We really need to, at that point, I think, start talking about, are we talking about Valentinian groups and how they're using John, or are we talking about the Paradics and how they're using John, because they all kind of move this in different directions.
Another thing I love about your book, April, is how you use modern movies sort of crystallize what was going on. And it's a great time because there's so many good Gnostic movies that have been put out. Like it's a great mythology of our time with the Matrix and the Truman Show and so forth. In this chapter on the Gospel of John, you draw from Dark City, which is again a great Gnostic movie. And this ties into Valentinus, but you do write that love is what makes us human. That's the theme. And in a way, that's a very Gnostic thing, isn't it?
I think it is, because in the Gnostic system, they really do understand God as love. Yeah, I haven't really tracked this out. There aren't a whole lot of other groups at the time who are really understanding God in those terms. So even Yahweh, you think about, you might say to me, oh, but wait a minute. He was like the good father to the children. Yes, he was, but he also punishes the children, right? That's not what the Gnostics were talking about. They were talking about a transcendent God who was all good, who is all love. And the human being is that. The human being is connected to that. That's the true nature of the human being. And I find that to be quite a wonderful statement, especially when we consider today's world and where we are.
I definitely agree. And going to the Valentinians, you bring up the movie Avatar, which I've always thought, well, it's sort of like you write, it's dances with wolves in space and so forth.
Right.
You argue it does have a Gnostic subtext because it talks about the whole Valentinian union with one's higher self. Could you explain a little bit about that, April?
Yeah, sure. I use the word avatar actually in order to talk about the spiritual self, who in the Valentinian tradition, they believe that each person has a divine self. They call it an angel. The angel resides in a heavenly realm and will wait you usually at the end of time when your soul or your spirit will go up into these realms and join with that angel in marriage, and then you have this union with this angelic self, and it's an eternal union. So the Avatar was an interesting parallel for me, where in this movie you have the main character who struggles with his human self and goes into that. I mean, it always looks like a coffin when he gets in that bed, and hooks up neurologically to his native avatar, and he becomes this big blue angel, I call him. And at the end of the film, his human self has come to the point that he has to make a decision to either join with that avatar permanently or die. And so that's the kind of moment around the mother tree where they're running this ritual where they're trying to join those two together. And that very much for me smacks of the Valentinian story of the union with that angel.
It's all about the sacred marriage, and even as you write, Sophia's fall is because she's too far away from the true God, that she yearns him, and she falls away from her own consort. And isn't the story Jesus is trying to marry her again?
Right.
So Valentinus was all about the love.
He was about the love, and he makes them a really distinct Christian, doesn't it? I mean, most Christianities at that time period are more body denying, and he wasn't. He was very much, I think, about eros and the power of that.
Yeah, and that goes back to Paul, and without love, you're just an empty symbol or something like that.
Right.
Another thing you write about in your book is, again, talking about the Gnostics as being ecstatics, and you write that they were really doing psychotherapy. They were going inward to sort of find out where this trauma was and where this great separation from the alien God. And you do write about a lot of their Gnostic rites. I think I wrote them down here. There's a ceremony to awaken, to purge, to mature the fledgling spirit, to integrate the mature spirit. How did you go about finding or creating this commonality with all their rituals?
Well, I'll tell you what happened is I was just trying to do a series of really deep studies of individual Gnostic groups and try to figure out what each of these groups was actually doing ritually and how they were interpreting scripture, and just try to get a really constructive picture of each of these groups. And as this project unfolded, I started to see some real similarities between what they were doing, not necessarily in the actual ritual event itself, but in what the ritual event was trying to do. And so that's when I started to think about this scheme in terms of rituals in these groups which awaken the spirit. And so I started kind of mapping out what those were. And then I noticed that these groups had rituals in which they were trying to purge the spirit of all of its soul inclinations and its desires and its passions, and they were trying to purge it of those things. And as they were doing so, they were talking about the spirit and the soul then being able to become lighter and kind of ascend through various sky elements, you know. I mean, they were very much astrological thinkers. All these different groups seemed to have mapped the skies in various ways, looking for literally the path that the spirit had to take as it fell down from the transcendent world into this cosmos and took on a soul and then took on a body. And they tried to trace this path out, and so they were clearly trying to work back up through, to find the way for the spirit to get out of here. And then I noticed that these Gnostic groups were also talking about rituals that they thought were taking place within the transcendent world, in which and here I'm thinking really about a lot of the Sethian materials that we had from Nag Hammadi or along these lines, where they get into these transcendent realms, and they begin having these rituals in order to transform their spirit into an even more purified spirit. So they will go up from like level 1 angel to, next level up angel to next level up angel, and they keep doing this until they get themselves to the point where they think the transcendent God is. And then they integrate. Then they have these sort of integration rituals with the transcendent God. So all I was doing was just noticing that these different Gnostic groups had rituals that involved these activities and with these goals. And so what I don't know is whether or not they staged these rituals so that, first of all, you get awakened, and then you get purged, and then you get, transformed, and then you get integrated. I don't know if all of them had all these levels or if they performed them in order or not. That's the sort of information I don't have.
A commonality in all these rituals, and I had to laugh because you show that in a lot of texts there's almost like a snoring sound that they had to do, like they're falling asleep. So I had to imagine being there and going, but the idea is that silence really is essential to any of their rituals. Why was silence so important, April?
Oh my gosh! Well, silence. Well, see, that was the other thing that surprised me, was how central silence was. And both church fathers talk about this, and they talk about it in terms of, they're trying to keep secrets. But when you look at the literature of Gnostics, from Valentinians to Sethians, etc., they all involve being quiet, being silent. So I started thinking about this in terms of, just ritual activity. When you think about people who contemplate, they sit and they are silent, and they're silent for very long periods of time. In the ancient world, they actually had practices of incubation, where you would, move into a sleep state, in order to, have a vision or a dream and contact the God. So I'm thinking they may have been using some of these sort of ritual activities of incubation, contemplation, in order to become silent. Now, why is silent important? Because the transcendent God is silent. So that's his main characteristic.
Yeah, that's the Valentinian, is it Bythos or Segi?
Yeah.
I'm forgetting which one.
Yes, Sage.
Silence is the font.
Right. I mean, for the Valentinians, my gosh, they talk about baptism. When they describe what baptism does, they say it is the ascent into silence. So it's just, and of course, the snoring mantras that I was talking about, those were largely found in the something materials. And then, of course, you have Marcus as well, who is performing some sort of contemplative activities with his church community. They're saying various vowels, right, over and over again. The Amen is a mantra that they use as well to bring about harmony and healing, quietude.
Yes, quietude. We all want that in some way or another. But what about the definition of, let's say, gnosis? Would you say the definition of gnosis change, or is it really just still fall under your definition? Knowledge of an alien God, and that the reality that all our gods are false and we can join this God?
Yeah, well, I mean, if you want like the what do I want to say?
The meme quotable version.
You're right. That would be how I would describe what Gnostic spirituality is. Gnosis itself is that direct experiential knowledge of the transcendent God. So it's that I have experienced that God. I have come in contact with that God. And usually this is done in these systems through ritual activities. Oftentimes it seems to me that this took a long time to do. So it wasn't like an instant rapture for people, but something that you trained to do in a community. Usually you paid money to do it.
Another thing I also wanted to address, and this is something even now I have problems wrapping my mind around, is and probably because I came from the Catholic matrix or mythology or tradition, is the idea of the soul versus the spirit. And you write over and over in your book that, sorry guys, but the spirit is immortal, but our souls, even if they reincarnate or go to the end of time, might not be immortal.
Right. And again, one has to be a little careful on that, because the Mandaeans have flipped the soul and spirit. So in their literature, they're in reverse. I haven't figured out why yet, but they reverse those items. And in the Manichaean literature, Manny doesn't really talk too much about a spirit. For him, it's kind of soul is everything, although there seems to be a light in the soul. So I'm not sure quite what to do with that. But we have in the other literature, the other Gnostic literature, a very clear view that the soul is mortal. It's going to die at some time. And it's the spirit that goes on. It's the spirit that's transcendent and reconnects with God. So again, this was really subversive for its time period, because the general view during this period, well, if we can even talk about a general view, certainly that you had a body and a psyche or a soul. Maybe both were going to die. Maybe the soul was immortal, so there was some talk about an immortal soul. And there was also talk about the Holy Spirit, which Christians thought you would get at baptism, so kind of a spirit that entered you at baptism, and then it transformed the soul into something that I guess could be immortalized. So there were all different sorts of paradigms to talk about this, but the Gnostics saying, no, soul's mortal, spirit's immortal, and that's what is going to be saved. So wake up, or you'll be destroyed. I mean, that's the essential message.
So there is a way that, for example, April and Miguel could continue on into eternity. It's not inevitable that April and Miguel are just going to dissolve at the end of time and our little divine spark without identity is going to leave.
Right. But we need to be awakened, and I think the Gnostics would say we need to be awakened, and we need to be hopefully reintegrated with God, experience gnosis before your death.
Or at least our higher self or guardian angel, the Valentinians. And what about the other argument that I've heard for years is the Valentinians split the human, the tripartition of the man, into psychic, nomadic, and hylic. Do you think these were, from your reading of the Valentinians, were these predetermined, or could we move up the ladder or down the ladder? Or is it just hard to say?
No, it's a really good question because it's been confused since Irenaeus. But my read of the ancient sources suggests that the Valentinians thought that everybody gets a soul and a spirit, but the spirit is a seed. They call it the pneumatic seed. And so it's either going to grow or it's not going to grow, and you really want it to grow. Okay? You want to grow the spirit. And so the groups that they name, as in like the pneumatics versus the psychics and the helix. Okay, so helix don't grow; they don't grow the spirit, and so the devil in us takes over. And so this is not a good. That's not a good group to be in. The psychics are developing and working on their soul. Their soul has been converted. They're Christian, okay? And so the spirit is not quite awakened, but the soul is kind of strong, and it's trying to do good deeds. And so what we want to do is then get those people and convert them to become pneumatics. We want to awaken up their spirit through a second baptism, which is how they ritually perform this. And then grow, and then allow that spirit then to grow into a full, mature spiritual being that can unite again with its angel at the end of time. That's the idea. So I don't know how you would describe those groups, more as social groups that you're able to move through as you, I guess, choose to become Christian and then choose to become Valentinian and go through the second baptism.
Beyond your excellent work on showing how subversive and original the Gnostics were, you also talk about other scholarship. I really liked your work on the, I don't know if I'm pronouncing it right, the Jeuians or Jeuians. And because the Pistis Sophia in the Book of Jeu have, as you write, has confounded scholars, and many have just walked away and said, but as you write, these two texts really are, they're an evolving spirituality about this unknown God called Jeu. Could you explain a little bit about that, April?
Yeah, sure. My understanding of this tradition really comes from Aaron Evans, who wrote a book on the books of Jeu. And as I read the book, I realized that I'd never really thought about the books of Jeu and Pistis Sophia in terms of different texts that were written at different time periods by a group as it kind of went through social change and formation. And so that was sort of a new thought for me for those books. And then as I kind of reread things, I was able to structure out kind of a narrative of how I thought this group developed and what it went through. And it looks to me like we are dealing with, in its early stages, an Egyptian solar religion that combines with, or how should I say, reads the Gospel of John and begins to understand itself in relationship to Jesus and the Gospel of John. And that over time, this group encounters other kind of Gnostic groups, which it then, like the Sethians, becomes to compete with. And as it competes with these groups, it alters its narratives and its mythology so that it ends up eventually with a very transcendent world that transcends even the Sethian world, which is just, how terrific is that?
Poor Barbelo got put down a few notches.
Exactly. So I had a wonderful time writing that section and thinking about this group that's been so neglected because scholars have tried to just shove it into categories we already know instead of reading it out and allowing it to be its own Gnostic expression. And again, I think this is one of the valuable things about understanding Gnosticism as a form of spirituality, and out of which spring up all these fantastic, very rich expressions of the spirituality in religious terms. I mean, this is an actual religious group that developed all sorts of rituals to advance themselves through the skies, to get themselves out of purgatories, and then eventually to make it up into the treasuries of the transcendent world.
For the listener, I recommend you read the whole book, but yes, it's a fascinating chapter, and April makes a very good case. Another fascinating chapter is that of the Mandaeans. You write about their history, how they're Gnostic, and their mythology, and so forth, but I had no idea that they were founded by a woman named Miriam. How did you find this information?
Well, I started just to, again, think through the stories that the Mandaeans tell, and this is a very curious story about Miriam being healed by one of their, you would call named sort of big beings of light who come down, and the story was very much a parallel to Mary Magdalene actually being healed by Jesus. And these sort of parallels are really so strong in the Mandaeans' narratives that I kept thinking, why are these parallels so strongly? It's not Jesus, but this Mandaean entity of light who is the main redeemer. And so I kind of started from there and then worked backwards. So I started to think about how Jesus becomes lapsed in this tradition. Why would that be? And as I worked back from these texts, a story emerged of this woman, Miriam, who appears to have collected, I think, kind of Jews from the diaspora who had come up from Jerusalem after Jerusalem had fallen in 70, and was started a kind of a baptismal movement on the banks, probably of the Euphrates, and eventually this movement is very much a Gnostic movement from the beginning, and they over time clash with the Christian groups that are in this area and clash with the Christians' understanding of Jesus, so that eventually Jesus becomes a lapsed character in their narratives rather than a central redeemer figure, and they replace him with this being of light. Although the story behind it remains the same.
And let's talk about the Gnostic legacy. As you write, the Church Fathers were, well, in a way, they were helping the Gnostic cause by just, writing down every little thing they did. I mean, even what the underwear they wore at night or something strange like that. But this got preserved, and eventually their text got preserved. And the Gnostic legacy seems to have continued throughout time for the better. And I might be speculating, but in a way, when they discovered these Hermetic texts in the Renaissance in Florence, and how these ideas started permeating in the Age of Enlightenment with the secret societies, and how these ideas went on to the 20th century, it's almost, don't you feel that the Gnostic spirit did live and in a way did free humanity in time?
Well, I think that the combination of individual religious experience and revelation, along with the kind of resurfacing of Gnostic texts, but also, as you say, that the continuation of that Church Father narrative has pretty much been there, right?
Right.
So, so what I want to say is Gnostic spirituality has remained throughout Western history because of those texts. So because of the heresiological literature with the church fathers, and then you get these texts like the Hermetica coming back in the Renaissance when they're retranslated from the Greek. Then you get these various finds in the 18th, 19th, 20th century, with the, Pistis Sophia, the Bruce Codex, you get the Askew Codex with Pistis Sophia. You get all the Manichaean literature that's been resurfacing, and they're still working on that. You get the Nag Hammadi materials that have come back into the flow. You have Gospel of Mary and the Berlin Codex. So you get all this material is coming back into the knowledge base or the cultural stream. And I think that what's happening is as people engage these materials, that it's really reformatting religion in America in really profound ways that we haven't even really scratched the surface on. So what I'm thinking is Gnostic spirituality is living on in those texts, and people, when they sit and they open up that text and they read it for the first or second time, and it engages them in deep ways, in deep spiritual ways that perhaps traditional religious literature hasn't. I think that's super important, along with confirming maybe religious experiences they've had. We have a new age of religion today because of it.
Like you said, there's still much work to do it, and I certainly hope you continue to do it. And beyond all of this, I'm not like going on your Facebook posts and stalking and looking for information, but you do write this in his book that the Gnostics actually helped your own path in life.
Yes, they certainly have, because they have. They've given me a certain freedom and liberation, right, to be able to look at religion differently than I was raised.
And before that, you talk about how you were a nurse and having an existential crisis, and you picked up the Gnostic Gospels by Elaine Pagel.
No, actually, it was not actually Elaine's book.
Oh.
I picked up the little book called The Other Gospels by Ron Cameron.
Oh, that's it, you're right.
And when I picked up that little book and I opened up the Gospel of Thomas and began reading it for the first time, it was a transformation, and there's no other word for it. I was, to my soul, transformed. And that the act of that text has always been with me, and I think it will always be with me. Perhaps because I had such a personal experience reading that text, I really can't say how much I think that the Gnostic spirituality is carried within these texts, and it resurfaces as new generations of people read them and take away from them the things that that they do. That sort of revolutionary religion.
Certainly very counterculture, and there was a lot of evidence put forth at the conference last year, which I really enjoyed.
Yes.
But I think that's all the time we have today, April. I'd like to thank you very much for coming on Aeon Byte and discussing your wonderful new book, The Gnostic New Age, How a Countercultural Spirituality Revolutionized Religion from Antiquity to Today.
Oh, thank you so much.
Please support Aeon Byte Gnostic Radio in any way you can. A few shekels here or there. Join my Patreon campaign. Buy some of me reality-dispanding, mind-expanding books like Voices of Gnosticism, Heretic, or Stargazer. Subscribe to our Archive of Past shows. Your continued donations keep this Red Pill cafeteria open. The various avenues to assist me are found at thegodabovegod.com. Support alternative media, away from the few corporations that own all mainstream media. I should mention that I am an Amazon.com affiliate, so any books you order from thegodabovegod.com grant me a kickback. In fact, if you order anything, whether it's clothes, appliances, or sex toys, click through the site and I will get a kickback from that as well. even if you don't order anything advertised at thegodabovegod.com. Much appreciation to you, Knights of Valis, Shining Crazy Diamonds, and Rainbows in the Dark who support this blasphemy on a